Secular humanists are committed to a method of inquiry. Namely, as the young man suggested before, they're committed in some way to the rationalist agenda. Namely, they say that all claims to knowledge or truth need to be tested by logic, by reason on the one hand, and by evidence and verification on the other. Now, there are many claims to truth in many, many fields. Bertrand Russell states, "It is undesirable to believe a proposition when there is no ground whatsoever for supposing it to be true." So the rationalists and the secular humanists say any proposition, any field in one sense should be justified, proven, tested, verified before you can accept it. Now, that method of inquiry really began to develop with the philosophers in the 5th century BC, but it is exemplified most dramatically in the 16th, 17th centuries with the development of modern science. So the modern methods of science illustrate the effort to test claims to knowledge objectively in a community of investigators by means of open, replicable tests. All hypotheses are submitted to the crucible of inquiry. Now, the great effort of the secular humanists is to extend the methods of the sciences to other areas of life, and in particular to the area of religion. There are so many claims in religion, in the Bible, in the Koran, in the Book of Mormon, a whole number of articles of faith that have not been examined carefully. And so secular humanists have said, look, let's apply these methods of rational inquiry, of reflective thinking, of critical thinking to the area of religion, and let's see if we can test it. Now, that is very dangerous, as you know. And as you know, believers, many or most, at least traditional Orthodox believers, have a passionate hatred of any effort to question the faith. And so the shaking of the foundations will lead Galileo to house arrest, or the shaking of the foundations will lead Bruno to be burned at the stake. So you have this great effort to censor, to limit inquiry into religious belief. And similarly, the secular humanists want to apply reason to the ethical domain, to ethics. Ethics should not be held immune to investigation. Let's take these ethical norms, let's examine them carefully, comparatively, critically. Similarly for politics or any claim. Now, granted that in certain areas, it is often difficult to know how you apply reason, rational criteria, in order to test the claims. And so the secular humanists say, well, if you don't have sufficient evidence, if you can't prove, demonstrate, verify the claim, then you should suspend judgment. So then skepticism becomes part of atheism, agnosticism, and of humanism. You ought to be skeptical, you ought to doubt a claim, and if there's insufficient evidence either way, or insufficient evidence at all, then you ought to take the road of the agnostic and say the burden of proof is upon the person who makes the claim. And if he can't or she can't claim it, then we ought to suspend judgment. Do mermaids exist? Do mermaids exist? Those lovely creatures. You say no, that seems unlikely. But if you drained all the oceans of the world, maybe they're slithering somewhere. And do you know for sure? Should you suspend judgment? Take the role of the agnostic? Well, I'm prepared to say, and you are, that it's very unlikely that mermaids exist. But in any case, you always leave open the possibility that you may be mistaken, that your knowledge is fallible, and that new evidence may come up. So the secular humanist is not dogmatic. He or she has an open mind, is willing to examine any responsible claim to knowledge, willing to look at the case for God or against God to see whether or not it can be supported. And that is the agenda, free inquiry into every area of human interest, applied with such power in the sciences, the need to extend it to other areas of life, including religion. Now, the second point in defining secular humanism is that the secular humanists now are willing to say that most likely the best and most reliable account of reality is science, or is what the sciences tell us. In America today, a large sector of the public draw upon these ancient religious doctrines derived from the Bible, written by a nomadic and agricultural pre-scientific society, written by men and women who were drawing on the best knowledge of their day based upon hearsay, an oral tradition, mythology. But so that the spiritual, supernatural worldview expressed the outlook of those days. And many people then want to draw upon religion, the arts, feelings, subjectivity, faith, intuition to describe reality. Now, the secular humanists say, look, the most systematic effort to understand the world, the natural world, is by the applied use of the rigorous methods of scientific inquiry. Therefore, probably the best account is what physics, astronomy, the natural sciences, biology, the biological sciences, the social and behavioral sciences tell us. So we ask, what is true about the world? And I think the answer is, we have to sum up. E.O. Wilson, in his recent book, Consilience, is a biologist, sociobiologist at Harvard. He argued that at this point, with the fragmentation of knowledge in America, in the universities, we need to sum up, to take an inventory, to give a cosmic outlook. And so that is what the secular humanists do. They're naturalists. Namely, we ought to look for natural causes and explanations, not occult causes and explanations. The human species is part of nature, has evolved over a long period of time. The theory of evolution is probably the most accurate account that we have of how life forms develop on this planet. So we can deal with the cosmic scene without the need for spiritualists, for occult forces and causes. And thus, the naturalists are non-theists. There's no need for that hypothesis. There's no evidence. You say there's a Big Bang and God caused the Big Bang, but what caused God to cause the Big Bang? So only push your ignorance back one step. So you had a naturalistic universe in which there is no dualism between mind and body, body and soul, in which there is no evidence for immortality of the soul, no evidence that after the death of the body, the spirit hovers and haunts, lives in some world, another dimension beyond. I mean, that is, many people believe that. They hope that. They hope that that is true. They have faith in immortality and salvation. But the scientific case for it has not been demonstrated. So we're very skeptical about that. We try to explain human behavior as best we can in terms of scientific accounts. Okay, so secular humanism is a method of inquiry. It is a naturalist account of reality. Now, the third point is what you've talked about. Secular humanism has an ethical doctrine, very important ethical doctrine. It is distinctive. It is in sharp contrast, as the gentleman here said before, with the religious, theological, supernatural theories. I mean, the supernaturalist says, from the existence of God, you deduce your commandments and duties. From the existence of God, you explain your ultimate destiny. If there's no evidence that God exists, and if the Bible and the Koran are human documents written by human beings, not divinely inspired, no evidence for that at all, not divinely inspired by God or gods, therefore your ethics must have a different source. And so the claim of the secular humanist is that ethics is relative to human interests, desires, and needs, that ethical principles and values grow out of human experience, They develop over a long history in culture and civilization. They reflect our common human needs, our common human nature. They're tested by their consequences as individuals and in society. So you can give a naturalistic framework for ethics without need to develop a supernaturalistic ethics. And the sharp difference between secular humanism and theological, supernatural, or transcendental ethics is that humanists focus on happiness here and now, the good life here and now, creative realization, fulfillment, enjoyment, pleasure, happiness for the individual and the society. Secular humanists have always emphasized self-determination, freedom, autonomy. The individual has the power, depending on social conditions, of course, to determine his or her own destiny, plans and projects. We are the sum of our goals and aspirations. And the problem of life is to lead the full life and to allow our choices to determine, within limits, of course, how and why and where and in what sense we shall live. Now, part of this difference between, let us say, theological ethics and humanistic ethics is theological ethics is often absolutist, derived from certain principles or premises. The humanist ethics is open to change and modification in the light of different social situations. Ethics and morality are changing as responsive to human needs. This doesn't mean that anything goes. The humanist believes that there are moral standards and values and that you can be responsible. And the fourth point, in addition to this humanist morality, incidentally, humanist ethics is derived from the great tradition of Western civilization. It grows out of Aristotle and Spinoza and Kant and John Stuart Mill and John Dewey and many others. So it's not simply an expression of caprice or taste or subjectivity, but it has its roots in reason and passion, but at least there's a rational effort to deal with values and to apply reason to the good life. But now the fourth point that I want to mention is that humanism, as it has developed, has a social philosophy or social polity. It is first, in our present day, committed to the separation of church and state, and the great founders of the American Republic were anti-clerical, most of them deists, who believed that you should not establish a church and have a state church. They were rebelling against the Church of England, and so the First Amendment expresses that basic political principle that there is a domain for the churches and there's a public domain, and that one should not interfere with the other. The polity of secular humanism is democracy, the democratic ethos, democratic civic virtues. You cannot find democracy in the Bible. You cannot find it in the Koran. Indeed, those documents have been used in an anti-democratic way historically. So that basically humanism is committed to a free society in which there is a right of opposition, in which you have a free press, and you have civil liberties. And also, in recent decades, it is in the forefront of those who want to build a world community. Beyond ethnic differences, focusing on human rights, and recognizing that we're all part of the global community and that ethical values and norms should apply in one sense to all people on the planet Earth, and so there's interest in ecology. Okay, it's taking longer than I thought to define secular humanism, but in any case, there are the critics today who are very powerful. Secular humanism, I submit, has been among the most influential philosophical, ethical, and scientific views of the modern world. It's equivalent to modernism, and it has had a powerful effect in transforming our institutions. And everybody in our society, in some sense, are humanists and secularists. But nonetheless, there's been this massive effort, in one sense, to rail against secular humanism and to rail against modernism. It's paradoxical, this great attack on modernism. So let me just talk about the two main critics. There are many critics, two main critics. The first are the supernaturalists, the transcendentalists. Illustrative of this, just to point to an intellectual basis of the case, Michael Novak, who was a theologian and a philosopher, in a recent op-ed piece in the New York Times, said, and I can quote him, "Secular humanism gave us answers for 500 years that no longer seem adequate, even to many who tried hard to be faithful to them. That is why so many far-seeing souls announce that we've come to the edge of the Enlightenment and are stepping forth into something new, untried, not yet transparent." Secular humanism, he recognizes, has been a dominant motive of modernism and has transformed the planet. Yet he says, we've reached the end of secular humanism, and what will replace it? He says at the end, we have come through a long and bloody century, the gulags of the 20th century, and something new is stirring everywhere. And this is the new spirituality and the new religiosity. And so the intellectual case against humanism is supported in many circles. Richard John Newhouse, the editor of First Things, former Lutheran minister, converted Catholic priest, very influential conservative magazine, says Irving Kristol, the father of William Kristol, who has become the kind of official ideologist of this, have said that we are at the end of the secular century, that secularism, which dominated at least this country for most of the 20th century, is over, and that we're moving into a new domain in which the naked public square is filled with sacred symbols and proclamations. So they are arguing then that as we move into the 20th century, there is going to be a repeal of secular humanism. One of the areas where there's this enormous attack now, as you know, is on sexual freedom. The humanists have argued that sex is good, that sexual experience is natural and normal, that is an expression of among the highest human pleasures, and that individuals ought to have a right to express their proclivities and satisfy their sexual needs and desires without repression by the state. Now the McCarthyisms of virtue are attacking this principle of privacy. The humanists have argued from Mill on down that the right of privacy of the individual in his own life is vital. They are denying that. There is no distinction between the private and the public, and now Big Brother enters into the bedroom and into the White House, as you're well aware of. So that supernaturalism then is attempting to focus and develop a whole new mode. Now, what do? They reject the 4 points that I made. First, they reject the appeal to reason and logic. They maintain that knowledge can be based upon revelation, faith, mystery, subjectivity, and intuition, and that the standards of science or critical thinking cannot be applied everywhere. They cannot be applied to religion. It's interesting that Pope John Paul, in an encyclical issued only 10 days ago, argues there's no distinction between faith and reason, and argues that you can, on the basis of reason, demonstrate the truths of the Christian faith. So he's an exception to so many others who would draw upon faith. Primarily, he wants to use reason. Okay, second, they reject naturalism. They argue that the naturalistic worldview is mistaken, is limited, because there are mysteries beyond. which we cannot understand or fathom, and God lurks in the transcendental realm over and beyond this world. Third, they argue, and here is where the battleground is today, you cannot be moral unless you believe in God. You hear it over and over again. You cannot be good and virtuous. If you don't believe in God, anything goes. One-night stands, promiscuity, caprice and subjectivity. And if you get rid of religion, you'd have a total breakdown of life. So religion becomes not only a basis for conscience, they argue, becomes a basis for the social order. And fourth, they argue that, they argue in regard to this moral point, that life would have no meaning if you didn't believe in God. Life would be empty if you didn't believe in God. Okay. And then fourth, they say that without belief in God, there is no foundation for democracy. So each of my points, they would dispute. Now let me respond to those four. Their rebuttal of the method of inquiry, of naturalism, of humanistic ethics, and of democracy. Let me reply to that. First, if you do not use the standards of rational inquiry and evidence, then on what ground can you say that something is true? If you cannot hope to justify a claim by replication, by clarification, by definition, then how do we know what is true or false? So if you abandon these rigorous methods of investigation, then anything goes. You can believe anything. You can believe in reincarnation. You can believe in Heaven's Gate. You can believe in the New Age. You can accept psychic phenomena. Any claim that anyone makes seems to be as true as any other unless there are hard evidence that you can testify. So I'm very dubious of their critique of the ordinary standards of critical thinking. Second, they claim that naturalism is mistaken. And what you get is supernaturalism. But what is the basis of supernaturalism? I think that the atheist is a skeptic because he says, or she says, the burden of proof is upon the believer. Unless they can demonstrate their claim, then we have a right to doubt their claim. The appeals to revelation in particular are uncorroborated. These historical revelations that are embodied in these ancient documents do not prove the case. Indeed, they're contradictory. They're contradictory not only within themselves, but between other religions. If you're willing to say that God exists, the question is, whose God? The God of the Koran or the God of the Bible? The God of Mary Baker Eddy? The God of the Seventh-day Adventists, of the Jehovah's Witnesses? The God of the Mormons? The God of any other point of view that you have? So it seems to me that to argue for faith and revelation is to place your premises on shaky ground. Now the Pope talks about the appeal to reason. I agree. But it seems to me the appeal to reason, as I understand it, would devastate the foundations of classical Christianity, Judaism, Islam, and so on. Now the third point, they argue that without belief in God, you cannot be moral. Now is that a fact? Think of it. How many people do you know who believe in God and are immoral? How many people do you know who don't believe in God and are moral? I mean, are you going to say that all the saints are in the churches and the sinners outside? No. That seems to me to be a libel and defamation. I mean, take Chinese Confucian culture, a great culture, thousands of years old, in which moral virtues are practiced without belief in God. Or Japanese civilization, in which parents are good to children and there's a kind of kindness and a kind of ethics of behavior. If you're going to restrict morality to belief in God. Whose God? The Christian God, the Judeo-Christian God? Then surely of the 6 billion people on the planet, that might encompass 2 billion. What about the rest? Moreover, if you say that ethics must be deduced from the fatherhood of God, it's interesting that on the basis of belief in the fatherhood of God, religionists have defended slavery. They've been for and against slavery. They've defended patriarchy, for and against women's rights. They've been for and against capital punishment. In America today, so many people are against capital punishment on religious grounds, and so many people are for it on religious grounds as well. For and against euthanasia, abortion, divorce. So if you say religion is a presupposition of morality, you end up with contradictory claims. The Catholics believe in monogamy. Protestants will accept divorce. Muslims will accept polygamy. All claim to believe in God. So that's an oversimplification. As a matter of fact, as we're well aware, in the name of God, great crimes have been committed historically, are being committed today. In Yugoslavia, the Eastern Orthodox, Muslims, and Roman Catholics kill each other with a vengeance, all in the name of God or their religion. In Israel and Palestine, Jews and Muslims will kill each other, all in the name of God. In India, Hindus and Muslims will kill each other. In Northern Ireland, Protestants and Catholics. So religion is no guarantee of virtue. Granted, many religions have been moral and have contributed to humanitarian impulses, but at the same time, infamous crimes have been committed in their name. As the Germans marched off to war in the First World War singing Gott mit uns, the French, mon Dieu, on the other side, slaughtered each other for a nationalistic aim. So you cannot say that that is the case. The fourth point, does democracy presuppose belief in God for its foundation? That surely is not true historically. The divine right of kings were justified in the Bible. Slavery was justified, leaving to Caesar the things that are Caesar, and to God the things that are God. Slavery was justified in the Old and New Testament. Oligarchy was justified, aristocracy, totalitarianism. Only 30 years ago in Spain and Portugal, you had totalitarian regimes, Opus Dei, believing in God and yet in a strictly authoritarian society. As a matter of fact, the development of modern democracy only occurs when the freedom of conscience is respected, individual autonomy is respected, the right of belief. This comes under the Protestant Reformation, granted, but it also comes with the development of humanism. And so it seems to me then that the critics of secular humanism on those 4 points have failed.